Thank you so
Marla,
much
how are
for
you?
joining me. Welcome to this
It's
chat
a
about
it's a
global
pleasure.
minimum tax and Vanuatu. Where are you at and what's going on
I'm
with you?
in Croatia, so I'm beginning to melt. I'm losing my body weight in sweat, and by the end of this, I'll be some sort of stick insect. I'll be like, I'll look like this. No, I'm in Croatia, in the Croatian area of Dalmatia, in a small island, which is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful place. And actually, I'll talk to you about Croatia and tax and blah 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 in a second. But it's for once I'm in a smaller island than you, which is a new
I
thing
love
for us.
it.
Which is
I
a new
love it.
thing
I
for us.
love it. So yes, David, let's talk about this global minimum tax rate that's, being hammered out by
Yeah,
the OECD. The US are the ones leading it, and now, I think over 150 something countries have agreed to this global minimum tax rate, except a few countries. About 4 countries are holding out and not agreeing. Your country, Ireland,
yes,
and Barbados, which is where I'm at and where I live now. Isn't that a coincidence? A
it
beautiful
is a
coincidence.
coincidence. It is
Yeah,
a
so of
beautiful
course
coincidence.
we have to have a chat about this. But tell
Yeah,
me,
yeah,
what are
yeah.
your thoughts around this global minimum tax rate and why your country is holding out and what's important about
Well,
this?
I think that if you look, Marla, at economic history, what you find is that countries which are sovereign, okay, so that they elect politicians to run their own affairs, use various different tools in their economic toolkit in order to attract in capital and or talent or both, or push away capital or talent or both. One of those sovereign tools is taxation. So I think we've got to establish the point that using your tax system to benefit your own people is an entirely legitimate right of any country. I think the first thing that the Irish political class and civil servants saw when they saw this OECD move, and by the way, the OECD has never created a job in Ireland, just so let's be clear about this. This is not an institution that we owe. No, but it's true. I mean, it's a think
What have
tank.
you done for me lately?
Yeah. It's a think tank in Paris. Very, very nice, very plush. If you notice, you don't have these think or any country that you might not live in. They really locate themselves in really nice parts of really nice cities, and they actually give themselves tax-free salaries, which is kind of ironic, but we can talk about that in a minute. So the very people who are actually arguing for harmonized tax have actually tax deferrals, which give them very, very low rates of tax. It's the European Commission, the ECB, OECD, all that. So, but the first thing is that tax is a legitimate part of your arsenal. That's the first thing. The second thing is poor countries, and Ireland was poor when we started this. We have become rich maybe as a result of this and other things. Poor countries that don't have any capital need to attract in capital, because without capital you can't grow. So how do you attract in capital? You make it cheaper than it is elsewhere, okay? How do you make it cheaper if you don't have it? Well, you tax it less. So consequently, to deploy capital in that particular poor country, there has to be some attraction for the owners of capital. The third thing is that countries with perennial current account deficits, as we had for many, many years, need to finance themselves in some way, shape, or form. So there's a sort of a perfect storm of legitimacy, of economics 101, if you will, and if the fact that you want to avoid consistent current account crises, which are unfortunately emblematic in poorer countries, because when you don't issue the currency that is particularly strong, you end up having to get it from somewhere, okay, in order to cover your import bill. So you take all those three things together, and it seems to me that it's irrefutable that small countries will deploy whatever they can. So what can we do? We can reduce our wages yet further in order to make us cheaper as a source of allocation for manufacturing and our services to export. But that means you're basically impoverishing your own people to enrich somebody else. So that's not a really good idea in a democracy, right? So then you think, okay, what else can I do? Well, you can do what has been done for, as I said, centuries. The great example I was just reading recently was the Shanghai Free Trade Zone between 1928 and 1948, which was amazingly deployed by Britain and France and Germany and the United States and all those big countries. So you basically you try whatever you can. Now, the question therefore is, who gets to set the rate? Right, that's the idea. Now, what is interesting for me is it's the net exporters of capital that have decided that now they want to stop the exportation of capital. And rather than look at their own countries and as to why capital might be leaving, they've decided to look at the countries capital is leaving too. And therefore they have identified all these things. And I think the Irish view is very simple, is that how can you sign up to something, but you've no idea what it's going to end up being, right? So if you are a country that isn't using its tax policy, then it's fine. But I'll give you a few statistics, right? When I was a kid, Ireland was the poorest of the rich. The Economist magazine had a 1988 front page article about Ireland. And it was basically, here's a country with a current account deficit, with emigration, with budget crises all the time, with a terrorist, a civil war in a part of it. You know, we had it all. We had it all going on.
Just like us in the Caribbean, right?
Exactly. So you think, okay, so how does that country in 1988, which was the poorest of the rich, end up being amongst the richest of the rich? What did they do? What they did was do a variety of things, one of which was to attract in foreign companies, right? Now, I don't think a country like that should be punished for its success, which is exactly what's happening now. Okay, I think that country should maybe be regarded as an example. Yeah.
Exactly.
But that's not happening.
It's a development model that has worked because it was an experiment, right?
And it mightn't have worked. And believe me, we tried things for 70 years that didn't work. We tried. So when you get out of, and you'll understand this, when you were a colony, what happens when the colonizer leaves, they don't just take their police and soldiers out, they take their money as well. So what tends to happen to colonies, when we become independent, not only do we have new uniforms on the street, new languages in the school, new history books in the curriculum, but we've no money. Because the people who owned the money, because the objective of the colony is that the colonizers rob the colony. That's why they have colonies. They don't do it for fun. It's not like, oh, we're going to the sun, you know, to hang out. The objective is to take the resources of the colony and bring them back to the motherland, okay? And that is a process that goes on in a sort of repetitive pattern, week in, day in, month in, year in. But then when the independence movements get the upper hand, that money leaves very quickly, right? So you end up with no institutions, no money, terrible credit rating, regarded as, and it must be said, as these people can't run themselves anyway, so let's just see how they get on. And,
Absolutely, yes.
And in the Irish case, that was probably right for about 70 years. And then about 70 years after independence, we've been independent for 100 years, we twigged this model. So that's the Irish, that's my view of the Irish position, which is quite unusual for a former colony, because former colonies tend not to stand up for themselves. We tend to be quite insecure. We tend to want the affirmation of the big boys. So, and particularly former colonies that are capitalists and democratic. I mean, a former colony that goes, let's say, all Marxist is one way, but a former colony that is democratic. So when I look at what happened in Ireland, I see Ireland is now the country in Europe with the highest proportion of foreign-born residents, higher than Britain, higher than Germany. It's 19%, right? It's also the country with the highest growth rates for the last 20 years. Now, of course, we're coming from a very poor start, but that's what happened. It's also a country that voted for gay rights, voted for abortion. It's the only country in the world that actually voted for marriage equality on a plebiscite. No other country's done it. Every other country's done it by, for example, by parliamentary diktat or legislation. So this is a country that's become wealthy, tolerant, open. We're really open to immigration. I don't think it's a bad model for other poor countries. Yet the OECD is saying it is, and I find that really weird.
No, and I agree with you, but there are a few things I want to that you touch on that I want to just explore a little bit. First of all, you said that your country got it wrong for about 70 years. We've been
Yes.
independent, most of us in the English-speaking Caribbean, for just like over 50 years, anywhere between 53 to 58 years, somewhere around there. So it means that if, judging by your example, we still have a couple more decades to go of messing up before we get this, I guess, our experiment right, like you
Yeah.
did.
I mean, this is, Marla, this is what I always say to the Brexiteers in England. You know, I can understand your wish for independence and sovereignty and your own flag and la, but just be warned, you know, you get there eventually, but the first 70 years is the hardest, and then it gets a little bit easier after that. Okay. So it is
Yeah.
difficult. It
Yeah,
is
and
difficult.
actually, I'm taking comfort in this because, we also, I suppose we're hard on ourselves in this region because we haven't really, I think, gotten it right yet. But it's good to know that other countries like yours took a little bit longer, and so we shouldn't feel too bad.
Yeah.
But the second thing you talked about that I want to just explore a little bit more is this whole idea of this whole post-colonial mentality where we want that validation from the
Yeah.
previous colonizers that we're getting it right. And you're lucky in the sense that Ireland was never blacklisted by the OECD, FATF, EU, and that kind of thing. But this is something that perennially affects us in the Caribbean. So of course we are not getting the validation, and this blacklisting, what it does is that when they tell us in some form or fashion you're not compliant, I mean not compliant with your standards, and you're a country that's been has grown these powerful institutions over centuries. We're 50 something years old, and how can you hold us to this standard? One, and two, these standards always change, and three, the standards don't apply to your own member states. And so we are, I mean, I'm guessing that in your development, post-colonial development history, you probably didn't have this kind of marginalization to deal with the way we do right now. And I think that accounts for something, but I just want to hear your thoughts on how important is it for us to continue. You said that we don't stand up for ourselves, but here I am trying to say that we kind of are standing up for ourselves, but maybe not in the right way. And of course, it's not as effective as it could have been. But what are your thoughts on that whole idea of standing up for ourselves?
I think that the problem with small countries is we don't get to make the rules. We are rule takers in the international world, as a general observation. That's the first thing. Therefore, when you do step out from the consensus, it's regarded as almost a violent act. Okay, but it strikes me that smaller countries need to plow a different furrow to bigger countries for a variety of reasons. One is that we are afflicted by what I would call the tyranny of size, okay, and the tyranny of geography. But the tyranny of size is one that, it's very, very hard for a company born and bred in Ireland to project its brand out from our small country, okay? You don't get economies of scale. It's very, very difficult to get the technology input. It's very, very difficult to actually, so if you're in America, you're in a market of 300 million, where they think like a country of 300 million, which is very different to us. If you're in Ireland, you think, okay, how do we generate companies that can compete in the international world? You have two options. One is you try and invent them yourself, okay, and you try and create them from scratch. And the other one is you actually hitch a ride in a company that's already been created by somebody else, right? So you take a little bit of their gig. And I've always heard the critics of this say, oh, what about Denmark? And it's a small country with lots of small companies. It is, but Denmark was an empire. Denmark owned most of Scandinavia. It owned Iceland. It owned Greenland. I mean, this was an imperial power for hundreds of years. Denmark was hardly ever invaded until the Nazis turned up in 1941, I think. Okay.
So they had assets and they had institutional strength.
Assets.
Yes.
All
yes.
that sort of stuff. They had institutional strength. They had very deep capital markets. They had what I would say, they were taking the resources of Greenland and Iceland, whaling resources, all sorts of things like that. Fisheries, etc. They had an army that projected its power all around Europe in the in the, if you think the 16th, 17th, 18th century. So what you find is that the only country that has never really had an empire in Europe that has created a thoroughly modern economy is Switzerland. And how did Switzerland do it? By taking in everyone else's money, by doing exactly what we're doing, right? That's how the Swiss do. They figured out
taxes.
Yeah, no taxes. Don't ask any questions. Bring the money in here. But I would make one other point. In the Irish case. So if we are a tax haven, right? The definition of a tax haven is people go there to hide money, right? Okay, they leave your country to hide money. How do you explain then that almost all rich Irish people are tax exiles? If we're a tax haven, we're obviously the worst tax haven in the world. If the rich Irish people go elsewhere,
yeah.
So I think it's important to push back. But to answer your question about the colonies and the colonial idea, it is true. I don't put too much store in it, because there has to be a moment in which you actually say, okay, we've been on around for a long time, but the scars
get over it
of colonialism are very, very deep. And that sense that you're just not worthy, that sense that your parents and your grandparents made compromises, made choices, those choices, there's a sort of a guilt about colonialism, and it takes a long time to get over it. It takes 2 or 3 generations. I was trying to explain to somebody recently why people from the west of Ireland, who I like very much, rarely give you a straight answer. I've thought of this a lot, right? Whereas people from the south of England will give you a straight answer straight away, right? Okay.
Right.
And I think the reason is it's an inherent echo of the disenfranchised. So the disenfranchised don't even know who they're talking about. Are we talking to somebody who's a friend, who's an enemy? Have we got the right to speak? Have we got the permission to speak? And I think it's a deep cultural legacy of having been dispossessed, occupied, kicked around in your own country, that you're almost afraid to give a straight answer because you're not quite sure who you're actually talking to. So my sense is that the economics of post-colonial countries is something that was very vogue in the 1960s and 70s. And I think it was a very interesting way of understanding our societies. It then got elbowed out by Friedman and all this sort of shareholder value and all these sort of stuff, which basically we now know is kind of ludicrous, right? So I think we should go back to a little bit post-colonial stuff, not to give us an excuse for all our failures, but to maybe to understand some of the mistakes we made.
Yeah, and I think David, it surprises me that we in the Caribbean haven't aligned and joined with Ireland on this common ground that we clearly have. But hopefully that's something you and me can broker.
Yeah, I think so. Why not? You've got you've got your reach and I have my reach, but it's important. It's difficult to be on such a limb, so to speak, but it's important for the world to understand why we are on such a limb. Now, after having listened to the evidence, they might say, yeah, but still, we need this flat tax. I mean, the interesting thing is we don't have a flat tax on anything else, anywhere. Like income tax between Ireland and the US isn't, VAT isn't flat, it's changeable, property tax, yada, yada, yada. So, my sense is also, but to give you some hope, Marla, I think this is a very, very long road, and I'm not too sure where we're going to end up. And I think
it's not going to happen overnight, that's for sure.
No.
The other thing about that tax that I find quite striking, it first started out at, I think, 22.5 or something like that. They first bandied about Janet Yellen and the US and the OECD. But there's an OECD paper that I'll send, I think I sent it to you, where they did some research on what are the various forms of taxation and their implications for growth. And they found that corporate tax is actually the worst tax as it relates to growth. It is actually, it's damaging for growth, as it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And therefore it's the tax that you should avoid. And yet still here's the OECD telling everybody, this is the global minimum tax that we should be aiming for. So that's the first contradiction I find in all of this. The second one is that clearly this 15% is arbitrary. And you would think that the OECD, the US, the Fed, the EU, you would think that they have enough resources and economists to do some empirical work to determine what might be the optimal rate. But instead they kind of, let's see how this will work.
Yeah, it's a little bit below here, it's a little bit above them,
Global tax policy here, and we're just coming up with an arbitrary number. That's the best we could do. I mean, I find this shocking, absolutely shocking. But this leads me into another area that I wanted to chat with you about, David, is that there are two countries. Well, the EU, first of all, and which we've talked about many times, the EU has these two blacklists, right? Which of course are appropriately named because not a single country on these lists is a white country, right? Not one. Could you imagine devising a methodology that's so precise that you manage to not catch even one white country in your tax haven blacklist and your second blacklist, which is the anti-money laundering, combating financing of terrorism tax blacklist. On both of those lists, you manage not to catch even one white country. So we know what this is about. But, there are two countries that appear on both of those lists, two countries only. One is my country, Trinidad and Tobago, where I'm from. So not proud about that. But the second one, and I apologize for my neighbor and his leaf blower, which he's quite fond of. The second one is Vanuatu. Have you ever heard of this country, Vanuatu, David?
It's off Australia somewhere, isn't it?
Yeah,
I don't know anything about it.
It's between Eastern Australia and Fiji. It's got like 80-something islands, 65 or so of those are inhabited. When you add all of the space together, the land space of the inhabited islands, it's just slightly bigger than Jamaica. So it's not big.
Oh, wow, it's small.
It's very small, and the population is about the size of Barbados, just a little bit bigger than the population here in Barbados, around 300,000. So small on many levels. It is also the poorest country. It's poorer than the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So it's the 30th poorest country in terms of GDP per capita in the world. It's right below Haiti. So very poor. They've only
below Haiti.
Below Haiti.
Oh my God.
Exactly. They've only been independent for like 40 years, 1980, so about 40 years. They've only graduated in December of last year from the UN has this least developed country classification, LDC. They've only graduated from that list in December of last year, which, by the way, last year they were hit by the pandemic, like all of us are, but also a hurricane. Well, they call it cyclone. We call it hurricane. And so this is a severely disadvantaged country. It is the most vulnerable country to natural disasters in the world. So this country is on its knees, okay? This country is on its knees, and the EU sees it fit to blacklist this country not once, but twice, but for being a tax haven, supposedly, and for being a money laundering destination. Shocking. And they were colonized by the UK and by France, both. I mean, you had one. We had
bad enough
many
having one, having the two.
I know, having two. And this is how they're being treated. And so I did some research and wrote about this, and it's really, to me, there has to be a point at which these big rich countries say, look, we need to just use our discretion here, right? The Tax Foundation Network found that it's only $7 million on average a year that's lost in Vanuatu due to tax evasion. $7 million.
Nothing.
But they get blacklisted, and blacklisting means there's reputational damage. Blacklisting means foreign banks have to do all kinds of enhanced due diligence for wire transfer transactions to take place. It means they even de-risk you. They say, you know what, I don't want to do business in this territory, and so we're not going to handle any of your accounts. And so it's really, really, from a socioeconomic development standpoint, it's stifling them. And tell me what your thoughts are. I mean, we talked about this global minimum tax. Of course, Vanuatu is one of the countries that will be forced to do this. But shouldn't there be some recognition and some allowances made for countries that are on their knees, that are struggling, that have weak institutions, that are post-colonial, that have never been able to get up off their knees and walk? And these big countries are just squeezing the life out of them.
Yeah, I mean, look, we know that when it comes to financing terrorism, Saudi Arabia is the big financer, direct financer of terrorism. And then you from Saudi Arabia, you go to Qatar, you go to Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And the reason they hate each other now is they both finance terrorism on the same side, but in different sort of ideological spectrums. So that's kind of silly. We know that big countries like Russia and the United States have, I mean, the history of the CIA is the history of destabilizing countries by financing what would regard as terrorism or freedom fighters or whatever, right? So there's no moral authority when it comes to pointing the finger. In the case of Vanuatu, I don't know anything about it, but I would say that, like all initiatives, proportionality is very important. Okay, the reason, for example, many people in Ireland would support the Palestinians over the Israelis is not actually an ethnic thing. It's actually to do with proportionality. It's to do with, okay, one crowd has nuclear bombs and a massive army. The other crowd is flinging second-rate missiles and stones, right? So that's why people think, well, one side has some sort of moral argument to make, which we should listen to. In the case of Vanuatu, I mean, if it's 7 million quid, it must be a really, really second-rate tax haven to be only generating so much. And I come back to Switzerland, for example. Switzerland was based entirely on absorbing in the money of the uber wealthy. Was it a tax haven? No, people will never say that. But clearly, it deployed the same methods as these small countries. And if you're really, really, really aggressively upset about the tax dodging nature of your own citizens, well, then go after your own citizens. Don't go after the country. So, I mean, my sense is that, but I don't want to go down the road either, Marla, that you say, you know what, dodgy money is okay, because dodgy money is not okay, right? So there is a fine balance. But I think to terrorize an already terrorized country would seem to me to be morally at least dubious, and there's some question marks over it. And it's back to the politics of power. You've got the power, so you can do whatever you want. Like you've pointed it out, but it's worth saying, like if you go to Kensington and Knightsbridge in London of an evening, and you look at all the apartment blocks, very few of them have any lights on. Now, what does that tell you? Is that nobody lives there. So the people who actually bought the apartments, these really expensive apartments, don't live there, but they have an address in the UK. Why do they have an address in the UK? In order to facilitate their money coming to the UK through the City of London and going back out. So, I think we've said it before, that one of the greatest facilitators of money, is it laundering of money moving in the United States? Holland, the Dutch have been doing it for years. So
absolutely,
I would think that there are an enormous amount of bigger fish to fry before you go after these poor people in Vanuatu. That's my opinion.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. And this whole issue of proportionality is something that's indoctrinated in the EU's laws. And the whole thing about, dirty money, funny money, I completely agree with you. There's no way we should be supporting that, endorsing that. But the point is, it's all relative. You can't penalize one country because there's $7 million that goes through every year. What about the countries that launder billions, if not trillions,
I agree with you.
And they don't get penalized. So it's really just unfair. And so, it's one of those other manifestations of that post-colonial hangover that, yes, we have our independence, but is there a level playing field? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And so it's very difficult. And I think the context in which, Ireland was able to develop and this experiment was able to bear a lot of fruit, we won't have that opportunity because there weren't blacklists. There wasn't that kind of pressure on Ireland to comply with an international tax level. When you joined the EU, you had to raise your corporate tax rate, but still your effective tax rate is very, very attractive. So we don't have this opportunity.
No, you don't. And I mean, the interesting thing about Joe Biden, and I mean, I would be a supporter of Joe Biden, particularly given what the alternative was 6 or 8 months ago. But what is happening in the US is an understandable yearning to reverse many, many years where the returns to capital were much greater than the returns to labor, which started with Reagan and Paul Volcker in 1980. And as you saw then over many, many years, people who owned capital and depended on capital for their income, so dividends and rents and stock prices, they became incredibly rich. And the people who depended on wages for their income, i.e. the workers, became relatively poor. So I can understand the dynamic in the United States. They're saying, well, okay, hold on a second. What we're going to have to do is bring back capital to the United States and tax it, right? So that's the background noise. It's not for some sort of pan-global tax rate that the Americans are doing this. It's for their own domestic agenda. And I can understand that. But on the other hand, they have to realize that during those years, other countries took their lead from the United States and framed policies around the free movement of capital. And now they are being penalized for something that the United States has come to the conclusion is not a good idea, right? So I think there is not only disproportionality back here, but there's also a deep unfairness. And then the question is, what do poor countries do? What are poor countries supposed to do in the future, right?
What are we supposed to do?
And you think, okay, well, look, for many, many centuries, or for at least for 1 century, we sent our people up to you, right? So the people who couldn't make a living at home because they didn't have enough innovation or capital or whatever, they got on their bike and they left, right? So the consequence of that has been a fear in Europe and the United States, a deep-seated fear of immigration, which every time there's a surge in immigration, you get a surge in the right wing and all that sort of stuff. But we have to come up with, if we're thinking of global policies, what do poor people do? What can a poor country do? If you think that in the year 2090, when I won't be around, but given your health kick, you still might be knocking around. But Marla, 4 out of every 10 people in the world will be African. Okay, so what are they going to do, right? We have a crazy situation. For every child born in the United States today, there are 4.4 children born in China, there are 8 children born in India, and there are 11 children born in Africa. So what are those African kids going to do? So the population dynamics is very, very clear that white populations are getting much, much older, much, much quicker, and we're not replacing ourselves. And black populations are actually replacing themselves in an extraordinary way. So are we going to say to these people, well, we have all the capital, we have all the brands, we have all the innovation, we have all the goodies, right? We're going to preach to you about globalization and one world, and we're going to tell you that you need to reduce your carbon footprint and all that sort of stuff. But we're not going to say that you can have any of our goodies or any of our money. I don't think that washes, actually. And it's not a sustainable message to give to the rest of the world.
Absolutely. And, I think that you're right. I think that the time for that is going to come. It's going to come to an end. I hope it's sooner rather than later, because we obviously don't have a whole lot of time. A lot of us in the Caribbean, we are climate vulnerable. We're heavily indebted because every so often a hurricane wipes you out. And, as you discussed earlier, we have current account deficits that we have to finance through debt and through FDI. So it's not a sustainable model, but for this constant, to me, this constant blacklisting of non-white countries that are poor and marginalized in some way or another, to me, it boils down to this unfair advantage being taken to another extreme. I mean, you talked about the US and they're wanting to bring capital back home, but they did FATCA. I mean, all citizens all over, not citizens, but people who are tax residents in the US have to declare money all over the world. And guess what? Guess who foots the bill for that kind of oversight? Not them. All of the countries that have these residents their banks and their regulators have to collect this data, collect this information, and in some cases collect the money and report back to the IRS. I mean, so they've already implemented a global tax, their tax policy globally, and exported it and exported the cost of compliance with it, which is not fair. But this continued pressure, I think there has to be some body, meaning the UN or some other body, that says, listen, this really is unfair. But I look forward to, also the fact that the members of parliament and the EU have also pushed back, and they've called out these EU blacklists for the fact that in the first place, there was a MEP that said there was one glaring omission in this tax haven blacklist, actual tax havens. All of the countries blacklisted as tax havens account for 2% of all money in tax havens globally. All of the big money launderers, exactly. So they're not even capturing what they set out to capture. But I hope that at some point there is some reckoning of everything you've just outlined, that, this is not ever going to stay like this. This power structure that we have globally, geopolitically, is not going to stay the same. And the means that they're using to continue to dominate is not sustainable. It absolutely
no, I mean, the question
not.
you just always have to ask is, what are the poor countries supposed to do? That's the question.
Yeah.
And if you don't come up with a plausible roadmap for people to say, okay, I'll follow this road, and here's the signposts, and la la la, we go along the way, then
you leave us with no options.
You
leave us with no options, and that's actually where the the conversation needs to begin. What do you want us to do? What do you suggest we do? But lucky for you, you guys caught this wave at the right time, and you were, if I want to use a analogy, you caught it before everybody. Well, not before the Swiss really, but you caught it at the right time. Before you were forced to revise. But thanks to your Minister of Finance for being a holdout and not leaving us all on our own.
But even a holdout is an extremely pejorative expression, because it means that you're in some way delinquent, and I don't think that's the case at all. I think that there's no doubt that going after illegal money is a good thing at the micro level, at the individual level. But there is a big macroeconomic dilemma, which is, how do poor countries get rich? Okay? And whose money do they use in order to do that? Because they don't have their own. Okay?
Nope, we don't.
So you had for many, many years the charity model, where white people would go into Africa and give people money. Okay, the aid model. And what we see is the Africans themselves have largely rejected that and said, that's not what we want. We want the chance to do our own thing. We want the chance. It is elemental to humans to innovate, to try to have skin in the game, to take a risk, to try and better yourself. This is what we're all about, right? It is not in the human psyche in general to sit around taking handouts. That does not make people happy, right? So you've got to think, okay, how do you spark the potential of every single kid around the world to think, I can do that too? And in order to answer that question, you have to get inside their heads. And inside their heads is that desire for upward social and personal mobility, right? that idea of the personal transformation, that I'm born here, but I actually want a lifestyle that's over there. And I'm going to drive myself to do that. And I think that if tax policy can help those individuals achieve their goals, well, that should be the objective, and that should be the outcome, and that should be the target. And to starve those people of opportunity because you're starving them of capital in a world of, frankly, MMT, where the Americans are making money up, seems to me entirely ludicrous.
I agree. And I couldn't have said it better myself, David. And fiscal policy, tax policy is everything in a small country because the government is relatively so big. And in countries like yours, where your monetary policy is pretty much handled in Brussels, you kind of it's really up to the fiscal policy to do a lot of the economic maneuvering and management. So, yeah, I mean, let's see how this goes, David.
Yeah.
I thank you so much for your time and for your absolutely brilliant insights as always.
Not at all, Marla. It's my pleasure. And hopefully the next time I see you will be on one of these little small islands, maybe bigger than this one. And I'll talk to you soon. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, and it hopefully wouldn't be so hot because I'm melting as well.
I know. I mean, look, okay. So just look now at the different complexion. Like, look at this. This is an Irish man who looks a very good impression of a crab or a lobster, okay? You should be out here in this sun.
Yeah, we'll do that soon. Take care, David.
All right. Cheers, Marla. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.